Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called the 10 greatest Miles Davis albums ranked. Notice I said greatest. So it's not my favourite albums. It's the ones that I think had the most influence and effect on music. Miles Davis changed the face of music more than once. He is one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century for doing that. He did that by changing the structure of jazz, changing how jazz operated commercially, and changing the sound of jazz, and bringing forth some of the most important musicians in the history of jazz into his group. Right, so very important musician. What have I got at number 10? Well, my number 10 is Birth of the Cool, which came out in the late 40s. I've tried to find my copy. I do have a copy and I couldn't find it in the mess that is my studio. It's here somewhere. I mean, I've searched and searched for it, but I think it's recorded around about 1947, 1948. It comes out just after his time with Charlie Parker. So, you know, Miles's first big gig is with Charlie Parker. He comes and replaces Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie has got this very florid, virtuoso, high register sound. Miles comes in equally virtuoso. I'm not going to have it said that he worked around his limitations, right? How many musicians could play with Charlie Parker and cut it? Miles could. He's a virtuoso musician, but his sound is different to Dizzy's. He has changed the sound of the trumpet, and there's a vulnerability there, right? And this vulnerability is going to enable Miles to play any tune almost and turn it into something very moving. This is going to make him very commercially appealing as time goes on. But we hear this sound, this vulnerable sound is then expanded out across a large ensemble that features people like Lee Konitz and Gerry Mulligan, and it's all been arranged by Gil Evans. This really is the birth of the cool, right? Not just the genre of cool, which we see in the 50s, cool jazz, you know, Gerry Mulligan, Modern Jazz Quartet, all that stuff, but also the idea of being cool. Miles Davis embodies being cool. It's like an introversion which is turned on its head and also almost becomes like an aggressive front. It's a mixture of detachment and aggression, but extreme vulnerability at the same time. This is what Miles Davis brings to music, and then we see it in people like James Dean, and we see it in Marlon Brando in The Wild One. But this really changes culture. You know, Miles Davis is one of those few jazz musicians who change culture. So, The Birth of the Cool is a brilliant album. It's incredible tunes on there. It's an incredible sound, and it's a sound that Miles goes back to with later albums, but never in quite the same way. Brilliant album. So at number 10 I have Birth of the Cool. Let's move on, or I'll get stuck on that and I'll be talking about that for ages. So right at the beginning of the career we have Miles Davis really innovating and creating a new sound. Right, the next album I've got at number 9 is this one, and here he is a few years, you know, towards the end of his career, still innovating and changing music. I would say, if I was going to pick one album that represents 80s cutting edge jazz, i.e. not this horrible Winter Marsalis, let's go back to the 1960s view of jazz that also emerged in the 1980s, but someone pushing the envelope, right, and creating new sounds, it would be this album. Now this album is a very commercial sound, and it's covered with every single technological breakthrough that the 80s had. There's tons of gated reverb and sequencing and all that sort of stuff, and so many jazz musicians at that time fall down the trap of that, but Miles doesn't. I can still put this album on and appreciate that darkness and that sort of lolloping stroll and Miles Davis' incredible trumpet tone that just cuts through. I think this is an absolutely great album. Is it the same album as Kind of Blue or Milestones or Birth of the Cool? Of course it's not. It's doing something else. You know, Miles Davis has overdubbed his trumpet parts in here, and I think it was the first time he'd ever done that. But it's done masterfully. You know, we must, you know, shout out for Marcus Miller. I think Marcus Miller is one of the great artists of being able to traverse that sort of, you know, application of pop commerciality into fusion. And he does it because he's really good at writing pop hooks, and it's covered in hooks. It's a fantastic album. So that's what I've got at my number 9. 2-2 by Miles Davis. Right, so what have I got at number 8? Well, towards the end of the 50s, Miles Davis revisited his association with Gil Evans and started to make more larger group recordings. Albums like Quiet Nights and Miles Ahead. There's a whole ton of them. They're absolutely incredible. You know, Miles with Gil Evans is a magical combination. Then we're talking, you know, a really big group, almost like a jazz orchestra. I think on these albums with Gil Evans, you know, Miles really puts the next chapter of jazz orchestration for large ensemble after Duke Ellington. He really pushes it forward. If I had to pull one album to represent that era, it would be this, which is an absolute beautiful album. I think it's the most famous album, it's the most influential album, and this album is a concept album because here he's exploring the Spanish tinge, as Jelly Roll Morton once described. You know, the Spanish tinge is very important to jazz. This is a fusion album. This is Miles taking the idea of that sort of Spanish modality, but also the sound and that sort of matador, Picasso idea and concept is so close to Miles's aesthetic, and he does it beautifully on here. And my favourite tune on here is Tom Piper. It's an incredible album, absolutely beautiful. Right, so what have we got at a number? Which way we're at? So I've done 10. 9 was 2-2. I've got 8 is there. So will we read it number 7 already? Okay. Hugely influential album. Many people would have thought that it should have come higher on my list, but of course I have to have a few, you know, controversial choices in. But this is in no way controversial. It's got to be in the top 10, and that is of course In a Silent Way. You know, that many people say is the beginning of jazz fusion. I see it as more the end of, you know, Miles using a classic quintet of acoustic instruments. He's exploring far more than just jazz rock on here. He's exploring, you know, deeper into modality, deeper into using the studio as a compositional tool, into ambient music, into sort of trance music, space jazz. It's whatever you want to call it. It's a really, really great album. I really like this album, but I really like Bill Laswell's remix on it on the album Panther Lasser. I always come back to that, and if you listen to that, you see the full visionary idea that I think the engineers and record companies couldn't quite get to when Miles was making this album. But that's what we've got at number 7. So what have I got at number 6? Well, after Birth of Cool, Miles Davis sort of disappears off the scene. He's got drug problems, and that keeps him away. But he comes back around about, I think, 54. He gets his act together, and he forms, you know, a classic quintet that actually features a whole bunch of different players. You know, it's got sort of Coltrane on saxophone. It's got Cannonball Adderley on alto. We've got Red Garland coming through on piano, Wynton Kelly coming through, we've got Bill Evans in it, the whole, you know, Philly Joe Jones, Jimmy Cobb, Paul Chambers. It's that classic quintet. Now we know the album that is most famous by that quintet is, of course, Kinda Blue, which is, many people think is one of the greatest jazz albums ever made, and I'm not going to argue with that. But actually, if you want to hear that quintet full blast, really showing what it could do, you have to go for this. And this, I think, is one of the greatest jazz albums ever made. If you just want to listen to a great jazz album, listen to this. It's an incredible album. One of the things really interesting is the pairing of Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley. They're both virtuosos. They're both all over the place. But Cannonball sort of represents the peak of everything that's happened in jazz up until that point, right? And Coltrane represents the future. But the way and the reason why it works is because Miles is in the centre of it, pulling it together. So often, Miles is using his musicians' brilliance to create new forms of music. And he can do this because by confusing those musicians and then throwing them into a situation where they do new things, he can continually centre that with his trumpet playing. And this happens on this album so much, it's his trumpet playing. Now, the opening track, Dr. Jackal, right, if you doubt Miles's virtuoso tendencies, go and listen to his trumpet playing on that. Is absolutely incredible. So we were at number 6, so what have I got at number 5? At number 5, right, I had to choose one of the great 70s fusion albums. Was I going to pick Live Evil? Was I going to pick Big Fun? Was I going to pick a Garter? And I nearly did. But I thought I've got to go to this because of the influence. And that's Jack Johnson. This is where Miles really takes on rock and roll. Right? Really takes on the electric guitar. Really takes on those beats. And it's a really definitive album in the history of jazz fusion, and I think one of the reasons is because it's the pairing of Billy Cobham and John McLaughlin. Right, I said John McLaughlin, and any of you who have checked out the new video that John McLaughlin's just put out about Shakti, he actually introduces himself and he actually pronounces his name, and we're going to go with this one now for all those people who criticise me for saying it the way I do. He says John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin. I say John McLaughlin. Right? So I feel a little bit vindicated for everyone saying I should be saying John McLaughlin. No, go and check the way he says it on that video. Right? So I have used this album and I've only put it in because John McLaughlin's on it and I could be vindicated in the way I say it. So there. Not going to say anything about Jack Johnson. I've talked enough about it on this channel as it is. Right. What are we at now? Right, so I think we're at number 4 now, aren't we? I hope we are. I feel so high and mighty after that. I've actually lost my place. In the 1960s, Miles Davis formed his second classic quintet. Tony Williams, Ron Carter, Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock. Some of the early albums like Four and More, really established Tony Williams as one of the greatest drummers in the world, right? Really created his reputation, and I nearly wanted to go for that. But I thought, no, just pick the best of those classic 60s quintet albums, and for me, it's this one, Miles Smiles. This quintet at this point has changed jazz. It's, you know, in the 50s he has his classic quintet. That's playing a sort of cooler version of bebop. Some people call it hard bop. I think Miles is in his own place doing that. And then Miles starts to bring in modal ideas. And when modality is where you build a composition around a scale rather than a chord sequence. And of course, Kind of Blue, that's why that album's so important. Once he gets this new band in, they bring in certain free jazz influences, but Miles takes those free jazz influences and he comes up with a way of playing which many people call time no changes, right? There's a whole other bunch of innovations that this quintet comes out with. The other one is the way people solo and the way they use space. Sometimes Miles will just repeat themes over and over again and allow the rhythm section to improvise whilst the horns hold the same repeated theme over and over again. You know, he does this to a greater extent on the track Nefertiti on a later album, and actually on Great Expectations on which is on Big Fun. But this is really I think the best of the 60s classic quintet albums. So that's well worth getting if you are a fan of Miles and want to build your collection up. So we're at number 3 now. Okay, this is the one I'm putting in, which will be controversial. This is at number 3. I think it's one of the Miles' greatest albums. This is why I put it so high, and it is Aura from 1989. All right, this is an absolute masterpiece. In the late 80s, Miles Davis he won a prize. I think it was a Sonic Prize. And he went to collect it, and in his honour this piece was composed, which is based upon Miles Davis's Aura, right? the tracks are intro, and then we have white, yellow, orange, red, green, blue, and electric red, indigo, and violet. This is a double album, and this is an incredible album that sort of is futuristic, but also points to every aspect of Miles's career. Miles plays incredibly on it. He really does. The lineup is insane. It's Miles Davis on trumpet, John McLaughlin on guitar, electronic drums, Vince Wilburn. You've got European musicians Thomas Clausen, Ole Koch Hansen, and Kenneth Knudsen on keyboards. We've got Bjarne Rapi on guitar, Bo Steef, the great Bo Steef on Fender bass, Niels Henning Orsted Pedersen on double bass, the drums Lennart Gravsted. We've got Marilyn Mazur on percussion, alongside Ethan Weisgard on oboe, Claude Anglais. We've got Niles Ege on harp, Lillian Transvist on vocals, Eva Thaces. I can go through all these. Anybody else? Because you basically now we're running into sort of the sort of orchestra that's on here, and additional trumpet and flugelhorn by Paul Mickelborg, the great sort of European jazz trumpeter. This is an incredible album. I think it's Paul Mickelborg that actually put it together. It's just mind-blowing. It's one of Miles's great albums. I've put it in at number 3 for a reason. If you don't know, you've got to check it out. It's definitely the greatest album from the 80s, without a doubt. And it's one of his greatest albums ever. It just goes to places that I don't think other albums by Miles goes for. And I know there's a lot of John McLaughlin fans here. John just burns on this album. So we're now at number 2. At number 2 I have Bitches Brew. I no longer own the vinyl because I have this huge box set with everything on it from those sessions. So that's what I'm holding up to represent Bitches Brew. Bitches Brew is very, very important in the history of jazz. After Miles had made In a Silent Way, right, I think he's looking towards the success that rock music's having, and he's seeing looking at the sales of his albums and look at the sales of people like Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone, and he decides to put together, as he said, the best damn rock and roll band ever. He actually puts 2 bands together now. Bitches Brew has got two bands operating at the same time. Now, I've done a whole video on Bitches Brew, so I'm not going to talk about it that much. You can, if you want to have my opinion, then go and check it out. But what's worth saying is this album's a difficult album. It's really out there, but it's sold a ton of records, and I think it really changes jazz history because of that. Bitches Brew shows the record company that jazz is viable, and it's worth putting money into artists like Weather Report and Return to Forever and the Mahavishnu Orchestra. It's the sales that count, and that's why that album's so important. I won't go on about it loads. In fact, I'll connect at the end of the video. There'll be a connection to Bitches Brew if you want to hear me talking about that for full 20 minutes. So we get to number 1, and you've guessed it, and I didn't want to put it there because it was so obvious, but I had to. And it's Kinda Blue, right, from 1959. Okay, so what can I say about this album that's not been said a million times before? Supposedly the biggest selling album in jazz, which is great because this is one of the greatest jazz albums ever made. The production and recording is absolutely impeccable. I think in the 50s hi-fi recording had really come in, stereo recording, and I think this album was one of the first great albums to really sound absolutely wonderful. That's one of the important things about this album that seldom gets mentioned. It's a concept album. In the same way as Sketches of Spain is about Spain, but Miles Davis' take on Spain, this takes on the blues. It's kind of blue, right? Whether these tunes are blues is debatable. Some of them definitely are. It's the idea of the blues, I think. And so throughout this album, it permeates this sort of dark, beautiful, ethereal sound. Okay? That could be a way of describing Miles's sound, but the inclusion of Bill Evans You know, Bill Evans being a virtuoso pianist, but with a completely unique vision, who is really bringing in elements from, you know, post-romantic music, like people like Debussy and Ravel, which of course Miles Davis loved as well, but Bill Evans is able to bring that directly into the music. So there's a chamber aspect, chamber music aspect to this album. But of course we have, you know, Cannonball and Coltrane. And Coltrane suddenly is put in a modal situation. Coltrane himself at this time is trying to push at the limits of jazz. But to put him in a modal, that also opens up this area. So what we see on this album is almost the beginnings of fusion with Miles Davis, the beginnings of free and modal jazz with Coltrane, the beginnings of that sort of chamber jazz with Bill Evans. It's a very interesting album. So that's what I've got at number 1. I feel I might have to do a whole video. I've got a lot to say about that and I can't fit it in all here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that video. That was my 10 greatest albums by Miles Davis ranked. And if you liked it, please like it, drop a comment in there, please subscribe, and if you want more of this, go over to my Patreon and you can get more. Thank you very much for listening.